material objection, on which I will elaborate shortly. Additionally, the entirety of Armenia's third complaint suffers from a fatal procedural flaw. Namely, to the extent that its complaint does arise out of a dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan with respect to the interpretation or application of cert, Armenia's invocation of the court's jurisdiction under Article 22 was premature. That is because Armenia failed to engage in negotiations with Azerbaijan in an attempt to settle that dispute, and failed to pursue as far as possible the limited discussions that did take place. From the outset, Armenia had its sights firmly set on commencing these proceedings before the court and using the fact of these proceedings to wage a public media campaign against Azerbaijan. This is Azerbaijan's objection that Armenia has failed to comply with the negotiation precondition required by Article 22 of CERT, on which I will also elaborate shortly. An overriding explanation for Armenia's broadly framed CERT complaint is the limited scope of the compromissory clause at Article 2 of CERT. Armenia cannot resort to international adjudication with respect to its allegations of international humanitarian law breaches, arbitrary detention, and enforced disappearance. Thus, it has been driven to shoehorn those complaints, which properly analyzed contain no discriminatory elements within its third application. This preliminary objection phase provides an opportunity for the court to define parameters for its substantive third jurisdiction, both in respect of the military conflicts between Armenia and Azerbaijan and with respect to other conflicts around the world. This would be especially timely, given the growing tendency to misuse CERT in order to bring within the preview of this court ever more wide-ranging disputes. I will make some further remarks with respect to each of Azerbaijan's preliminary objections before handing over to members of Azerbaijan's council team who will lead you through the details. As I have mentioned, and as elaborated at paragraph 71 of Azerbaijan's preliminary objections, dated 21 April 2023, Azerbaijan raises two preliminary objections with respect to Armenia's third complaint. The first is that Armenia's complaint should be dismissed in its entirety due to Armenia's failure to comply with the negotiation precondition at Article 22 of CERT. Azerbaijan views that precondition as a solemn obligation of all CERT parties and as a critical precursor to CERT proceedings before the court. Consequently, Azerbaijan approached the negotiations with respect to Armenia's CERT complaints seriously and with a view to settling the CERT disputes. It is important for the court to appreciate the context here. Prior to Azerbaijan's attempt to negotiate the CERT disputes, Azerbaijani and Armenian representatives had not met for 30 years. As Professor Talman will explain, the exercise of setting even the basic framework for the negotiations to come took many months. There followed just two short online meetings of any substance, lasting a few hours each, before Armenia filed its application at the court. To say the least, this came as a surprise to Azerbaijan. There had been no genuine negotiation process before Armenia filed its complaint. The result is that the legal requirements for the invocation of the court's jurisdiction under Article 22 were not met. Armenia filed its application before even allowing a third meeting to discuss the parties' positions. Having received Azerbaijan's opening positions, Armenia simply broke off the discussions on 15 September 2021 and filed its pre-prepared application the very next day. In Azerbaijan's submission, to declare the negotiations precondition in Article 22 met in such circumstances would be to render that precondition devoid of meaning. Azerbaijan requests that the court use this opportunity to emphasize the importance of compliance with applicable negotiation requirements before invoking the court's jurisdiction. Azerbaijan's second preliminary objection is that even if the negotiation precondition is met, several elements of Armenia's application fall beyond the material jurisdiction of the court under Article 22 of CERT, because they are not capable of constituting racial discrimination within the meaning of CERT. Specifically, Armenia's complaints about the alleged murder, torture, and inhumane treatment of Armenians during armed conflict, the alleged arbitrary detention of Armenians, and the alleged enforced disappearance of Armenians all fall beyond the parameters of a CERT complaint. Rather, they engage issues of international humanitarian law and other norms of international human rights law that are clearly not subject to the court's jurisdiction under the CERT. There is one exception. As indicated in my letter to the court of 5 April 2024, in its written observations, Armenia belatedly particularized some of its allegations of mistreatment with respect to Armenian civilians during the armed conflict, with reference to specific evidence purporting to indicate misconduct that is capable of falling within CERT. Now, as a responsible litigant, and in the interest of the court's efficient conduct of this proceeding, Azerbaijan has decided to withdraw its ratione materiae objection with respect to any of those adequately particularized allegations. Mr. Wordsworth will pick up this issue further in his speech today. For now, I would simply note that while it accepts that the court has jurisdiction over those exceptional allegations, Azerbaijan is certain that it will defeat them at any merit stage. In its formal submissions, at page 750 of its memorial, Armenia tries to dress up the relevant elements of its application as CERT complaints by simply adding the adjective discriminatory before each of its allegations, and emphasizing that the allegations concerned ethnic Armenians. You can see it on your screen. But simply adding these words to describe allegations that engage other norms of public international law without any accompanying specific evidence of racial discrimination is not sufficient to make those allegations capable of falling within the CERT. Armenia had to do more. Two further points warrant attention before I hand over to Professor Tolman. First, Azerbaijan's ratione materiae objection concerns only those aspects of Armenia's CERT complaint that fall beyond the subject matter of the Convention. It is not aimed at excluding the entirety of Armenia's CERT complaint from scrutiny by the court at this preliminary stage, at any merit stage, excuse me. Thus, Azerbaijan has raised no objection at this preliminary stage with respect to a number of Armenia's cert complaints, including those connected with hate speech and alleged failures to take effective measures to combat racial discrimination. What is at stake here is the scope of the court's jurisdiction under Article 22 of CERT. In Azerbaijan's submission, the court can, and if it rejects Azerbaijan's first preliminary objection, then it should, building on the logic of its recent judgments, define the limits of its jurisdiction under the CERT. Second, while they fall beyond the court's substantive jurisdiction under CERT, Azerbaijan does not in any way condone alleged violations of international humanitarian law and other international human rights norms. On the contrary, Azerbaijan takes such allegations very seriously. The record shows that, unlike Armenia, Azerbaijan has not shied from convicting its own nationals of appropriate crimes where the allegations have been proven through judicial process. Of the dozens of Armenian POWs and other detainees taken during the Second Karabakh War and its aftermath, all the POWs and most of the detainees have been repatriated to Armenia. The rest are still incarcerated because they either have been convicted of serious crimes, including mercenarism, torture, and murder, or are currently being prosecuted for war crimes, terrorism, or separatism. In other words, the ongoing detention has nothing to do with racial discrimination. Similarly, Armenia's allegations concerning enforced disappearance of Armenians have nothing to do with racial discrimination. But Azerbaijan takes them seriously and has been working in cooperation with Armenia to ensure clarity, transparency, and mutual trust in the search for missing persons from both sides. Mr. President, members of the court, that concludes my opening remarks. Azerbaijan's distinguished counsel will now address each of the preliminary objections raised by Azerbaijan. First, Professor Talman will address you on Azerbaijan's objection relating to Armenia's failure to comply with the negotiation requirement under Article 22 of CERT. Second, Mr. Wordsworth will address Azerbaijan's ratione materiae objection, with particular focus on Armenia's complaints about the alleged murder, torture, and inhumane treatment of Armenians during the armed conflict. Third, Professor Boisson de Chazourne will address you on Azerbaijan's ratione materiae objection related to the alleged arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance of Armenians. Thank you, Mr. President, honorable members of the court, for the privilege of appearing before you. I now kindly ask you, Mr. President, to invite Professor Talman to address the court.
I thank the agent of Azerbaijan for his statement. I now invite Professor Talman to take the floor. You have the floor, sir.